In this news roundup of the week, where we cover some of the big news, but also some of the stories that matter, but that you might have missed, on Friday, the 10th of November, 2023. The ongoing Israel-Hamas war continues to divide opinion on the West. Shell sues Greenpeace for £1.7 million as it refocuses its attention on its traditional oil and gas business. India is looking to engage in local weather geoengineering as its scientists plan cloud seeding to clear Delhi's air pollution. Australia offers visas to all citizens of Tuvalu, the island nation closest to disappearing under the rising seas. Space Force says we should be somewhat concerned about the creativity that world powers are showing in getting weapons into orbit. And China's Xi Jinping has struck a blow for his country's very own culture wars. But the reviews are mixed at best. Israel's conflict with Hamas continues to dominate serious attention this week, of course. Israeli forces advanced to a Hamas headquarters in the northwestern Gaza Strip and continue to seek to clear territory and track down high-profile Hamas leaders. Hamas's long-documented strategy of siting its operations and its tunnels and all the rest of it in sensitive locations, such as hospitals and schools, has been largely successful in framing Israeli operations against them as largely hitting civilian targets. While supporters of Israel have taken high civilian casualties as a reflection of Hamas's own callous disregard for the people they're supposed to govern, obviously the opponents of Israel have had plenty of headlines and images to feed their own perspective. And it was presumably Hamas's calculation from the start that such action would win them support and drain support from Israel and the United States over time, at least in some of the places that matter most to them. And that certainly seemed to be the case this week, as the media reported leaked communications from American diplomats to the Biden administration about growing fury against the US in the various Arab nations of the world. One cable from the US Embassy in Amman said that America was, quote, losing badly on the messaging battle space. And an example of what that looks like in practice came from the embassy in Cairo, which reported the editorial from a state-run newspaper there, opining President Biden's cruelty and disregard for Palestinians exceeded all previous US presidents. This may be why Secretary of State Antony Blinken came out today with the most direct condemnation of Israel made in public by the administration, saying that, quote, far too many Palestinians have been killed. Far too many have suffered these past weeks. Israel has continued for its part to complain about US media outlets doing things like reporting Hamas estimates of civilian casualties without critical scrutiny. And Israelis have been outraged, to say the least, to learn that certain Western photographers working for CNN, the New York Times, Reuters and Associated Press were embedded with Hamas terrorists during the actual massacre of civilians that sparked the conflict. Now, the news organisations have denied accusations that they themselves may have had advance notice of the attacks, but it's hard not to see that the photographers themselves must have had. One of those photographers, Hassan Azaya, was shown in a separate photo smiling as he is kissed by Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Both Associated Press and the New York Times said they had severed all ties with him. Even notwithstanding the apparent expression of actual support, it does raise the inevitable moral question: at what point does a photographer observing and recording the murder of children and the rape of women and all the rest of it, rather than acting to try to prevent those acts, at what point do they become complicit? The Israeli government was clear, and it said that the individuals concerned crossed, quote, every professional and moral red line. For the time being, it seems inevitable that the actions will continue, the ripples of consequences and polarisation across the world will do likewise. This is not changing course anytime soon. Now, it's by no means the only established narrative that we will see time and time again. Thankfully, not all of them are quite so stark in terms of the human consequences. So, for example, over the decades since campaigning NGOs first came to the fore, there have been a number of times when apparently plucky underdog campaigners took on the big corporations, and usually won, at least in the fight for public opinion, even if they lost on the facts of a specific case. The question is, in the era where environmental campaigners have been rather more controversially visible, with tactics that often disrupt or outrage the general public, will the same David versus Goliath dynamic still hold true today? Well, maybe we're about to find out. Shell is suing Greenpeace for £1.7 million after a group of protesters occupied one of the company's vessels in the North Sea earlier this year. This comes as Shell's current CEO, Wael Sawan, has been tacking its focus away from green energy and back to its traditional fossil fuel focus, which, short-term, of course, remains reliably profitable. This has involved scaling back investment in renewables, potentially even selling the renewables business off, although that hasn't been confirmed. Indeed, just a couple of months ago, an open letter from Shell employees was posted internally and then inevitably leaked to the media, expressing dismay at the change. Well, Shell has said that it would settle with Greenpeace for a smaller £1.4 million sum, which isn't that much smaller, to be fair, if the campaign group promised not to protest on the company's property again. Greenpeace has countered with the offer that it would agree to the no protest provision if Shell complied with a court order to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030 across all of its activities. Shell has apparently decided that instead it would see Greenpeace in court. Thank you very much. The dispute goes to the heart of a genuine dilemma that should be exercising those serious about the energy transition, but mostly just passes people by, which is that even the most ambitious net zero programs worked out by governments foresee a major role for oil and gas, diminishing over time for sure, but necessarily significant in scope across the next few decades. Now, businesses can continue to make good profits from a declining sector, has been seen through history, depending on the circumstances. So, demonising those who necessarily provide energy that society needs, it's kind of easy to do, but not necessarily that helpful. That said, energy companies have every incentive to push beyond the implied parameters of that role, and they can make sizable profits by every increment that they can scale things back, activities that may have real consequences in terms of the severity of future climate change. So it's not as though they can be simply left to their own best judgment. At least, that's the argument made by the best campaigners. Of course, the worst campaigners simply say that they're all war criminals and we should shut the whole thing down tomorrow, apparently oblivious to the consequences that would have. And that's relevant, of course, because it's the action of the worst campaigners, the Just Stop Oils, that have lost a significant amount of public support for the cause. Greenpeace could and would validly complain about being lumped in with such actions, and they no doubt hope that people will see them as entirely separate. Not sure the public spends a lot of time drawing such fine distinctions. So, will this be another epic David versus Goliath conflict, as was the Brent Spar in the 1980s, with the plucky campaigners tweaking the nose of a corporate monster? Or will it be fantasy dream world hippies being unrealistic in the face of cost of living realities and behaving in a way that is inherently dangerous to boot? All of that is an open question until it actually gets to court. We've heard about the muttered discussions about whether scientists might collaborate to geoengineer the climate, involving things like pushing material into the stratosphere that would deflect some of the incoming sunlight, thereby reducing global warming, albeit temporarily. Many people respond to such proposals with high suspicion, on the basis that if you got it wrong, you could make things worse rather than better. The question is, how do people get used to the idea to the degree they start to contemplate it as a potentially reasonable step to take under the circumstances? Well, maybe they don't, but if they do, it probably comes from starting with more localized experiments. Such an experiment may soon be arriving in India, as the government there and its scientists is contemplating a major operation of cloud seeding to trigger heavy rains in New Delhi. The purpose of this would be to clear at least some of the huge cloud of air pollution that covers the capital ahead of winter. It comes from a variety of sources, particularly vehicle emissions from heavy industry, construction dust, and the burning of agricultural waste, stubble burning of rice crops generally. Some of that, particularly the latter part, originates from other Indian states, but collecting at New Delhi where there's almost no wind to disperse it. Now, earlier this week, the pollution there was rated at 506 on the Air Quality Index scale, categorised as hazardous. In a twist, this was improved in the last day or so, with some actual spontaneous rain, although the relief is expected to be temporary. The original target was around November 20th. Scientists were expecting a fair degree of cloud cover over the city and were hoping that there would be sufficient moisture content to be able to be triggered into heavy rain by cloud seeding with salts, including silver iodine. Now, that may be delayed thanks to the recent clearing, but authorities are expecting the pollution to return, particularly after Diwali, the Festival of Lights, where people will likely defy a ban on firecrackers, causing pollution to spike again. The project, being led by the Indian Institute of Technology at an estimated cost of 10 million rupees, is targeting an area approaching 40 square miles. Now, it wouldn't be the first time in the world that a government has turned to cloud seeding. Mexico, the US, China, Indonesia and Malaysia have all dipped their toe into that pool, often inspired by attempts to improve air quality and to water crops during drought. But many of those were attempts to deal with one-off difficult circumstances, whereas the India situation happens regularly, affecting 20 million people. If seeding becomes a regular part of dealing with the problem, rather than radical solutions like, trying to reduce the causes of pollution at source, then it's arguably one major location that gets used to the idea that we don't tackle that pollution, we try to manipulate the weather, or indeed the climate, to cope with the consequences instead. Now, the head of America's Space Force, Ron Lurch, told the New York Times this week that they are seeing a growing number of different kinetic kill vehicles that are likely to be roaming around in orbit soon on behalf of various hostile states. These include Russian nesting doll satellites that are designed to damage other spacecraft, while other craft are being designed to cast nets or to grab onto their targets with grappling hooks. China has uncrewed space planes that are expected to develop capabilities via AI-powered satellites. Lurch said that over the next 10 years, we expect to see satellites that can spray chemicals or use lasers to blind other satellites. All of this comes as more and more of human society is becoming reliant on services from the growing network of satellites for things like GPS, precision agriculture, weather monitoring, high-speed broadband internet access, and so on. So, should current conflicts expand to bring the major powers into a direct face-off? disrupting your adversary's access to those essential services, that it's become dependent on being delivered in that way, it's obviously one relatively easy way to give yourself tactical advantage. We saw a trial run of this in 2020 when Russia tested an anti-satellite missile against its own low Earth orbit redundant satellite. That test created significant protest at the time due to the massive cloud of debris that was generated, adding to the large amounts of rapidly moving space junk around the Earth, adding to the hazards of any space travel. Last year, Russia argued at the United Nations that it might conclude that SpaceX's satellite network could be considered legitimate military targets. Elon Musk responded rather bullishly at the time to that, saying that SpaceX could launch satellites faster than Russia could launch anti-satellite missiles. Although, if Russia decided to go full scorched earth, or a scorched sky, I suppose you would call it, how many satellite kills it would take before the dispersed debris basically accumulated to make orbital operations impossible full stop? It's an interesting and fairly appalling question. Now, the citizens of the island nation of Tuvalu, famous for being a low-lying atoll island in the South Pacific that is likely to be the first to be swallowed by rising sea levels, they have been given the right to live in Australia. Tuvalu, with a population of just 11,000 people, has been grappling for some time with the unprecedented question in the modern world order of what happens to a state when its territory no longer exists, at least in a viable way. And it's not so far away, with most of its territory less than 16 feet above sea level, and with a large part of its capital expected to be flooded by 2050. The answer is apparently that it will become dispersed. Australia will give up to 280 Tuvaluans per year a visa allowing them to live and work in Australia. Now, at that rate, assuming that everyone took it up, it would take 40 years for the entire population to move, should they choose to do so. So that's a guarantee of residency, but it's not within a bit of territory carved off specifically for the continuation of the island state. Basically, those people would just be absorbed into Australia. Before that, they create a partnership called the Whallapili Union, providing a security pact and adding funding to Tuvalu's coastal adaptation project, which aims to expand the main island by 6% per year to try to keep it viable into the future. By the way, whenever a topic like this comes up, there are inevitably people in the comments sharing their hallucinations about what they imagine to have been claimed about the Maldives. Rather separate group of islands. I did a video looking in detail at both the Maldives, which no climate scientist has said is going to disappear, and Tuvalu, which is in much more difficult waters literally. I would refer you to that video, which you can see up here somewhere, if it's a topic that interests you. And finally, there's a new film series in China which was released online last month. Now, you might be aware that China has gotten rather good at releasing blockbuster, homegrown movies in recent years. You might be aware of that, can't say I was, but apparently it's a thing, so maybe you should be wondering if this is the latest in that dynamic tradition. Well, not exactly. When Marx Met Confucius, snappy title, is a state propaganda film aimed at popularising Xi Jinping thought. Chairman Mao was, of course, a proponent of Marx and a disparager of Confucius, at least rhetorically, because Mao wasn't, by all accounts, averse to tapping into Confucian tradition from time to time to support something that he wanted to do. But that's okay, because obviously we don't expect consistency from our mass-murdering dictators. That would be tremendously unfair to them. In any case, Xi Jinping, who fancies himself as a figure as serious and important to Chinese development as Mao, and seeks to distinguish himself from the other lesser beings who came before him, is pinning his strand of political philosophy on a reconciliation between the two traditions. And the new film series uses a dialogue between Confucius and Karl Marx, separated though they might have been by many, many centuries. And it focuses on an idea put forward by Xi 2 years ago around the idea of second integration. Chinese scholars have argued that the move shows a degree of urgency on the part of the government in trying to establish its legitimacy with the people, a legitimacy that became increasingly framed around China's economic prosperity. Well, that prosperity has somewhat stalled, and so if a regime relies on economic success for popular consent, it could easily find itself in trouble. So it needs deeper roots than that. And don't forget, Xi Jinping placed a huge amount of his personal authority on the zero-COVID strategy, which then collapsed dramatically when popular acquiescence for it finally ran out and the policy was dramatically reversed. So, have the people of China been lining up to watch and embrace this new media sensation? Yeah, not so far. The film seems to have received mixed reviews at best. Die-hard Marxists don't like the diversion from Mao's rejection of Confucius. Confucian websites have avoided discussing it at all at the point of shooting this video. Prominent Chinese bloggers overseas, such as Teacher Li and Mr. Shen, both said they found the film bizarre and cringeworthy. The main problem with Xi Jinping thought as the new guiding philosophy of China seems to be that people don't really think there's much substance behind it, not much thought. So, what will they do next? Worth watching carefully. All is not what it seems beneath the surface. Now, regular viewers will be aware that this is the first news roundup for quite some time. And you may be wondering, well, we've seen 3 other videos this week from Mallen, and now a news roundup on the Friday as well. Is this a new thing that will continue from this point forwards? Well, let's see. I'll be trying to keep it going through November as an experiment to see if the increase in content makes a difference to the fortunes of the channel. If you want to encourage that, please consider supporting this channel on Patreon at patreon.com/Mallen Baker or via PayPal using the link in the video description below. This channel would not be possible without that support, and my thanks as always to those who currently give it. Times are not easy in the world, that's for sure, so that support is all the more valued. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.